A silent shareholder disguises himself as a low-level employee to expose the company's corruption. But when he finally reveals the truth, his most dangerous enemy is closer than he ever imagined. Derek Coleman stepped out of the subway station and into the bustling streets of Midtown Manhattan. The towering skyscrapers surrounded him, their glass windows reflecting the golden hues of the morning sun. He adjusted his tie, took a deep breath, and headed toward the imposing headquarters of Eagle Corp. Today wasn't just another day at the office. It was the beginning of a carefully orchestrated plan. For years, Derek had been the silent majority shareholder of the company, a legacy left to him by his late father. Yet, his presence had never been acknowledged by the one person who seemed to wield all the power. Margaret Holloway, the company's CEO and his mother-in-law. She had always dismissed him, treating him as an outsider in both the family and the corporate world. To her, he was nothing more than Elizabeth's husband, a man she barely tolerated. Rather than asserting his authority from the start, Derek had chosen to observe from within. He had joined Eagle Corp under a false identity as a low-level IT analyst, blending in with the workforce, analyzing the corporate culture, and identifying its flaws. The past months had been eye-opening. He had seen firsthand the toxic elitism and racial undertones that govern the company's structure. Employees of color, regardless of their skills or experience, were often overlooked, while mediocrity flourished under the guise of pedigree and personal connections. As he entered the building, the security guard barely looked at him before waving him through. The contrast was stark. He had watched executives in designer suits receive respectful nods and warm greetings, while employees like him, dressed in less ostentatious attire, were treated as invisible. He had experienced this treatment countless times, but each instance fueled his resolve. Taking the elevator up to the IT department, Derek was met with the usual indifference. His colleagues rarely engaged with him beyond work-related conversations. It wasn't that he hadn't tried. His friendly attempts at small talk were often met with forced smiles or polite disengagement. It was clear that in Eagle Corp, status dictated interactions. At his desk, he powered up his computer and glanced around the floor. The open office layout was meant to encourage collaboration, but in reality, it only reinforced social hierarchies. Analysts and junior employees sat together, working silently, while upper management occupied private glass-walled offices that overlooked the floor like watchtowers. Derek had spent months quietly gathering intel, observing the subtle and not-so-subtle ways Margaret ruled the company. She was revered by some, feared by most, and respected by few. Her word was law, and those who opposed her found their careers short-lived. She cultivated an atmosphere of exclusivity, ensuring that power remained in the hands of a select few. Even Elizabeth, her own daughter, struggled under her mother's expectations. Margaret had never been shy about her disdain for Derek, but Elizabeth, ever loyal, had fought to keep the peace between them. He opened his email to find the usual flood of system updates and maintenance requests. But one message stood out. An all-staff meeting had been called for later that morning, led by Margaret herself. These meetings were rare, and when they happened, it was usually to deliver sweeping announcements. Derek knew that this was his moment to see Margaret in her element. He had watched her from a distance for long enough, but today, he would witness firsthand how she wielded power over the employees. He needed to understand her tactics, her presence, her influence. He wasn't ready to reveal himself just yet. That day would come soon enough. For now, he would remain the overlooked IT analyst, quietly watching from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Margaret Holloway walked into the conference room with the air of someone who expected absolute obedience. The room was already full, employees seated in neat rows, eyes fixed on the empty podium at the front. The air buzzed with quiet tension. Whenever Margaret called a meeting, it meant one of two things: a major corporate shift or a public dressing down of an unlucky subordinate. Derek took his usual seat at the far end of the room, unnoticed like always. He observed as the senior executives took their places near the front, their postures stiff, their expressions wary. Margaret ruled through intimidation, and no one dared to question her authority openly. As she took the stage, her ice-blue eyes swept over the room with an expression of mild disinterest, as if she barely registered the faces before her. She adjusted the microphone and spoke, her voice sharp and commanding. "As you all know, Eagle Corp stands as a pillar of excellence," she began, her tone clipped and authoritative. "And yet, I have been deeply disappointed in the performance of some departments." A ripple of unease ran through the audience. Margaret was famous for delivering criticism as if it were law, cold, final, and unquestionable. "Innovation is the cornerstone of our success," she continued. "And yet, I see complacency, stagnation. Some of you seem content with mediocrity, and that is unacceptable." Derek noticed how her words sent waves of anxiety through the room. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Whispers were exchanged in hushed tones. Margaret wasn't merely addressing a problem. She was singling out individuals without naming them, instilling fear before dropping the hammer. Then, her gaze landed on him. She frowned slightly, as if just now realizing his presence. Derek met her stare without flinching, waiting for what would come next. A cruel smirk ghosted across her lips before she looked away, continuing with her speech. But Derek knew what that glance meant. Margaret had noticed him, acknowledged his presence in the worst way possible. He wasn't just another nameless employee in the background anymore. He was a target. As the meeting wrapped up, Margaret made a show of thanking the executives in the front row before dismissing everyone else with little more than a wave of her hand. Derek remained seated, watching her carefully. She turned to leave but then hesitated, glancing back at him briefly before exiting the room. It was a warning. Derek exhaled slowly. The game had begun. Derek sat at his desk later that afternoon, typing away at a maintenance request when his inbox pinged with an urgent email. He clicked on it and found a message from Margaret's assistant. "Report to the CEO's office immediately." He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. It was no surprise. Margaret had singled him out during the meeting earlier. Now, she wanted to make an example of him. The walk to the top floor felt longer than usual. The hushed murmurs of passing employees did not go unnoticed. By now, word had spread. Everyone knew that when Margaret summoned someone like this, it usually didn't end well. He reached her office, the grand doors towering over him, and knocked once before entering. Margaret sat behind an imposing mahogany desk, her manicured fingers tapping idly against its surface. Behind her, the New York skyline stretched endlessly, but Derek only had eyes for the cold expression on her face. She gestured to the seat in front of her, but he remained standing. Margaret arched a brow, amused. "Suit yourself," she said coolly. For a moment she simply studied him. Then she sighed as if bored. "Derek, I've been watching you," she began. "And I must say, I'm rather disappointed." Derek said nothing, letting her speak. Margaret thrived on control, and he wouldn't give her the satisfaction of reacting. "You've been in this company long enough to know that we have certain standards," she continued. "And yet, I don't see the ambition. I don't see the initiative. What exactly have you contributed to Eagle Corp?" The question was a trap. Derek could list every security flaw he'd identified, every inefficiency he'd flagged, but it wouldn't matter. Margaret had already made up her mind. "I do my job," he said evenly. Margaret's lips curled into a smirk. "That's exactly the problem. We don't need people who just do their job, Derek. We need visionaries, leaders." She leaned forward. "And frankly, I don't see that in you." Derek clenched his jaw. He had spent months observing how she crushed those she deemed unworthy. Now it was his turn. She exhaled sharply. "Effective immediately, you're dismissed." There it was, the final blow. Around them, the room was silent, except for the faint hum of the city beyond the glass windows. Derek forced himself to remain composed. Margaret was watching for any sign of weakness, any flicker of emotion that would validate her superiority. Instead, He straightened his shoulders and met her gaze with unwavering steadiness. "All right," he said. "Go ahead. Fire me." Margaret blinked, clearly expecting more of a reaction. Perhaps a protest. Perhaps anger. But Derek simply nodded, turned on his heel and left. The moment he stepped out of the office, the air in the hallway felt different. The tension had shifted. Employees stole glances at him, their faces a mixture of curiosity and sympathy. No one spoke. No one intervened. They all knew Margaret's word was final. Derek walked toward the elevators, calm and measured, but inside, his pulse pounded. This wasn't just another power move from Margaret. This was personal, and it was far from over. As the elevator doors closed behind him, a single thought burned in his mind. She had no idea what was coming. Derek stepped out of the Eagle Corp building and into the crisp autumn air of Manhattan. The city bustled around him, indifferent to the fact that his life had just shifted in a way Margaret Holloway could never anticipate. As he walked down the sidewalk, his mind replayed the events of the last hour. Her condescending tone, the smirk on her lips as she dismissed him, the unspoken message that she had finally erased him from her world. But she hadn't. Derek wasn't defeated. He had expected this. In fact, it was the final confirmation he needed. Margaret had played her hand exactly as he had predicted. Now it was his turn. He turned onto a quieter street, stepping into a coffee shop he often visited when he needed to think. The aroma of freshly brewed espresso filled the air, grounding him. He ordered a black coffee and settled into a corner table, pulling out his phone. There were already messages from Elizabeth, his wife. He didn't read them yet. He needed to be clear-headed. His mind was already working through the next steps. The months spent working inside Eagle Corp had given him more than just insight into the company's toxic environment. He had gathered hard data, financial inconsistencies, questionable promotions, and a pattern of bias in hiring and firing practices. Margaret ran Eagle Corp like a monarchy, but monarchs only reigned as long as their subjects allowed it. And Derek had the power to overthrow her. He took a slow sip of coffee, his jaw tightening. The first step was simple. He needed to remind Margaret exactly who he was. She had seen him as a lowly IT worker, someone beneath her notice. She had fired an employee. But tomorrow, she would face the reality that she had fired the majority shareholder. Derek tapped his phone screen, dialing a number he hadn't used in a long time. The call connected almost instantly. "Derek," came the deep, familiar voice of James Carter, the CFO of Eagle Corp and one of the few people Derek trusted in the company. "James," Derek greeted, keeping his tone calm. "We need to talk. Tomorrow's shareholder meeting. It's time I take my rightful place at the table." There was a pause and then a quiet chuckle. "About time. I was wondering how long you'd let her play her games." Derek's lips curled slightly. "I wanted to see just how far she'd go. Now I know." James exhaled. "She won't see it coming." "No," Derek agreed. "She won't." Hanging up, he leaned back in his chair, his mind already piecing together the conversation he would have with Margaret in less than 24 hours. She had dismissed him as nothing. Tomorrow she would have to face the truth. Derek Coleman wasn't just another employee. He was her boss. And soon the entire boardroom would know it. The next morning, Derek stood in front of the towering Eagle Corp building, watching as employees filtered inside. The very same people who had barely acknowledged his presence yesterday would soon witness a revelation that would shake the foundations of the company. Straightening his tie, he stepped forward, passing through the glass doors with the quiet confidence of a man who belonged there, not as an employee, but as an owner. Upstairs, the executive boardroom buzzed with conversation. The quarterly shareholders' meeting was always a spectacle. Margaret Holloway sat at the head of the long oak table, her expression sharp as she exchanged pleasantries with the other board members. To her, this was just another routine gathering, another chance to cement her power. The doors opened, and a hush fell over the room as Derek stepped inside. Margaret's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she regained her composure. "Derek," she said smoothly, feigning surprise. "What are you doing here? I believe you were dismissed." Derek pulled out a chair at the table and sat, meeting her gaze with unwavering calm. "I'm here in my capacity as a majority shareholder." A murmur rippled through the room. Several board members exchanged puzzled glances. Margaret laughed, though it was forced. "That's a bold claim. If you're referring to your minor inheritance." James Carter, the CFO, cleared his throat and placed a thick folder on the table. "Actually, Margaret, that minor inheritance accounts for 83% of the company's stock." The air in the room shifted. Margaret's fingers tightened around the armrests of her chair. "That's impossible." Derek leaned forward, his voice even. "My father founded this company, and he left his shares to me. I chose to observe quietly, to understand how the company was run." He let his words hang in the air. "And now I see exactly what needs to change." Margaret's eyes flickered with barely restrained fury. "This is absurd. You have no experience running a company of this magnitude." "Maybe," Derek acknowledged, "but I know enough to recognize mismanagement, favoritism, and a culture that rewards connections over competence." He turned to the board members, his voice clear. "Eagle Corp isn't thriving under this leadership. It's suffocating." The silence in the room was deafening. Some of the board members shifted uncomfortably, while others watched with curiosity. James broke the silence. "Derek has the voting power to call for a leadership re-evaluation." Margaret scoffed. "You think you can walk in here and strip me of my position?" Derek met her gaze. "Let's put it to a vote." Margaret's jaw clenched, but she had no choice. The rules were clear. If the majority shareholders called for a leadership assessment, the board was required to comply. One by one, the members cast their votes. Margaret's supporters, though loyal, were outnumbered. The final count was undeniable. James cleared his throat. "Effective immediately, Margaret Holloway is removed as CEO of Eagle Corp." Margaret's face drained of color. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. Derek stood, buttoning his suit jacket. "It's time for a new era at Eagle Corp. One built on merit, not manipulation." He turned, walking toward the door as the weight of the moment settled over the room. The tables had turned, and Margaret Holloway had finally lost. Margaret Holloway sat frozen, her hands gripping the edge of the table as if it were the last thing tethering her to reality. The boardroom, once a place where her authority was absolute, had turned against her in a matter of minutes. Derek remained standing, his gaze steady, watching as Margaret processed what had just happened. He had seen many emotions flicker across her face: shock, disbelief, anger. But now there was something else: fear. James Carter cleared his throat, shifting the attention back to business. "With Margaret's removal, the board will need to appoint an interim CEO until we finalize a permanent replacement." One of the senior members, a man who had been quiet throughout the entire meeting, spoke up. "I suggest Derek Coleman." The suggestion sent another ripple through the room. Derek knew this moment was pivotal. He had spent months in the shadows, observing, preparing. Now he had the opportunity to lead. But he had no intention of making this a personal victory. It had to be about the company's future. "I appreciate the confidence," Derek said, his tone measured. "But I believe we should open the floor for discussion. Eagle Corp needs leadership that puts the company first. If I am to step into this role, it will be with full transparency and the support of this board." A few of the more hesitant members nodded, reassured by his approach. Margaret, however, let out a hollow laugh, her voice dripping with disdain. "You think you can just walk in here and run this company? This is bigger than you, Derek." He turned his gaze to her, his expression unreadable. "No, Margaret. This company is bigger than you." The weight of his words settled over the room. Margaret had ruled Eagle Corp as if it were her personal empire, but her time had ended. James adjusted his glasses and glanced around the table. Let's proceed with a vote. The process was swift. Derek was unanimously elected as the interim CEO, and though he accepted the position with humility, he could feel the electricity in the air. This wasn't just a leadership change, it was a reckoning. Margaret stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the polished wood floor. "This isn't over," she muttered, her voice tight with fury. Derek didn't flinch. "For your sake, Margaret, I hope you accept this outcome with dignity." She scoffed but said nothing more, storming out of the room with her head held high, her pride the only thing she had left. The moment the doors closed behind her, a collective breath was released. One of the younger board members turned to Derek. "What now?" Derek straightened his posture, feeling the full weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. "Now we rebuild. We fix what's broken. And we create a company that values its people as much as its profits." James gave a small nod of approval. "Welcome to the real work, Derek." Derek exhaled slowly, knowing this was just the beginning. But for the first time in a long time, Eagle Corp had hope. Derek stepped out of the boardroom, the weight of the morning's events pressing down on him. The halls of Eagle Corp felt different now. No longer a place where he was invisible, but one where his presence demanded recognition. Yet, there was no satisfaction in what had just transpired. He had won the battle, but the war was far from over. As he walked toward his office, his phone buzzed. "Elizabeth." He hesitated before answering. "Derek," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "Is it true?" He closed his office door behind him and exhaled. "Yes, Margaret is out. The board voted me in as interim CEO." Was. Then a sharp intake of breath. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Derek's jaw tightened. "I did what had to be done. Your mother was driving this company into the ground." Elizabeth's voice wavered. "She's devastated, Derek. She built that company." "No," he interrupted, his voice firm but controlled. "My father built that company. Margaret took control and twisted it into something toxic. You know that as well as I do." Silence stretched between them, heavy and unyielding. He knew this moment had been inevitable. Elizabeth had always stood between him and her mother, trying to keep the peace. But there was no peace left to keep. "She's my mother," Elizabeth finally whispered. "And I'm your husband." His voice softened. "I need to know where you stand, Liz." Another pause, then a shaky sigh. "I don't know." Derek closed his eyes. It wasn't the answer he wanted, but it was the one he expected. Margaret had always had a hold on Elizabeth, and even after everything, that grip wasn't easily broken. "I need time," she added quietly. Derek nodded to himself. "Take all the time you need." But deep down, he wondered if time would ever be enough. Derek sat behind the CEO's desk, a place he had never envisioned himself occupying so soon. The office, once Margaret's fortress, now felt different. Sunlight streamed through the tall glass windows, casting long shadows across the sleek furniture. Everything about this space had been curated to exude power. But to him, true power wasn't in grand gestures. It was in action. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. James Carter stepped in, his usual composed expression tinged with something Derek hadn't seen before: optimism. "Quite the morning," James said, settling into the chair across from him. Derek let out a breath. "That's an understatement." James nodded. "The board supports you, but they'll be watching closely." Margaret ruled through control. "You'll need to show them something different." "That's the plan," Derek replied. "No more nepotism, no more favoritism. We rebuild with integrity." James smirked. "Sounds good in theory, but change this big won't be easy. Margaret's inner circle is still in play." Derek leaned forward. "Then we start at the foundation. I want a full audit of hiring and promotion practices. We create a path for real talent, not just those with the right last name." James nodded approvingly. "I'll get on it." As James left, Derek's phone vibrated. A message from Elizabeth. "We need to talk." Derek sighed, knowing that conversation was inevitable. But for now, his focus was clear. Eagle Corp wasn't just going to change. It was going to transform. Derek stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, watching the city sprawl beneath him. Eagle Corp was finally his to lead, but he knew the battle wasn't over. Margaret had left quietly, but silence was never her strategy. His phone buzzed. James Carter's name flashed on the screen. "We have a problem," James said the moment Derek answered. Derek turned from the window, already anticipating the worst. "What is it?" James sighed. "Margaret's been making calls. Investors, suppliers, even the press. She's spinning the story that she was forced out by an unqualified outsider." Derek clenched his jaw. "She's trying to undermine my leadership." "Exactly. And some people are listening. She still has influence." Derek exhaled slowly. He had expected Margaret to retaliate, but he had hoped she'd take her loss with more grace. He should have known better. "She wants a war," James continued. "If we don't act fast, she'll make it look like you're the villain in all this." Derek paced the room. "We handle this smartly. No counterattacks, no public feud. We lead by results. I want a press conference scheduled. I'll address the company's future and reinforce our vision." James hesitated. "Are you sure that's enough?" Derek's gaze hardened. "Margaret built this company on control. I'll build it on transparency. That's how we win." James nodded. "I'll set it up." As he hung up, Derek turned back to the city. Margaret was playing her last card. But he wasn't going to play her game. He had his own. And this time the rules had changed. The boardroom was filled with reporters, employees, and key stakeholders. The tension was palpable, but Derek remained composed as he took his place behind the podium. Cameras flashed as he cleared his throat and addressed the room. "Eagle Corp has entered a new era," he began. "One where transparency, merit, and innovation will drive us forward." The murmurs of the audience faded as they listened. Margaret's narrative had gained traction, but this was his opportunity to reshape it. He outlined new initiatives, diversity-focused hiring, ethical business practices, and a commitment to fostering genuine talent. The questions came quickly, some pointed, some skeptical. Derek answered each one with clarity, refusing to be drawn into Margaret's game of personal conflict. By the end of the conference, the tide had begun to turn. Margaret's influence was waning, and Derek's vision was taking hold. As he stepped out of the conference room, Elizabeth was waiting for him. Her expression was unreadable. "You handled that well," she said softly. Derek searched her face. "Does that mean you've made your decision?" Elizabeth hesitated, then nodded. "You were right about my mother. She never saw you as an equal." She exhaled, looking away. "I just wish it hadn't come to this." Derek reached for her hand. "It had to. For both of us." She met his gaze, and for the first time in weeks, he saw understanding in her eyes. They weren't the same couple they had been, but maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild. As Derek looked back at the towering building of Eagle Corp, he knew the real work was just beginning. But for the first time, he was exactly where he was meant to be. What would you do if you had the power to change everything but had to lose everything first? Would you be willing to risk it all for the truth, even if it meant going against those closest to you? Derek's journey was never just about revenge. It was about redefining power, integrity, and his own place in the world. Click on the video on the screen to continue this journey of self-discovery and transformation. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. See you in the next video.